Hello everyone, my name is Kenton Kivestu. I'm an ex-BCG consultant, an ex-Googler, and the founder of RocketBlocks, an online platform that helps students prepare for case interviews. In today's RocketBlocks mini lesson, we're going to talk about a really important topic, which is coachability. And the reason I want to spend some time talking about this is because it's one of those topics that candidates don't even realize they're being graded on. And not only that, they don't realize they're being graded on it, they don't even know exactly what it is and why it matters so much. So what we're going to do in this RocketBlocks mini lesson is talk about coachability. We're first going to define what exactly does it mean to be coachable. What are the firms actually looking for? Second, we'll talk about why does it actually matter to be coachable? Why is it such a big deal in the interview and on the job? And third, we're going to walk through some actual examples from an interview experience of what it means to be coachable and what it looks like when someone demonstrates good coachability versus not. So let's go ahead and jump in. Okay, so what is coachability? Coachability is the ability to listen to feedback, consider it appropriately, and apply it as necessary. Now, let's take a second and break down that definition because there are three parts and each of them is really important. The first is listen. You need to be open and hear the feedback that's coming into you both in an interview and on the job. The second part is you need to consider that feedback appropriately. You need to give it kind of due diligence and think about what's coming in, reconcile it with what you know, and use it and then apply it as necessary. That's the third part. So each of those is really important. And I wanted to call out those different pieces because some people, when they first think about coachability, think, oh, it's just like if someone gives me a tip, I've got to go do that. Or if someone gives me a piece of advice, I should follow it. And maybe that's the case that you should follow it or you should take that tip, but not without considering it first. That's a really key step in being coachable. If you just take advice and do it, then you're more like a lemming than someone that's coachable. Coachable means that you are thinking, you are hearing the feedback and considering it and then applying it as it really makes sense. You're getting feedback, you're thinking about it, and you're using it to make yourself better. So that's what coachability is. Now let's talk about why it actually matters so much. Okay, so why does coachability matter so much? I think a lot of people think, well, if I'm really smart and I get hired by one of these consulting firms, why do I need to be so coachable? And the reality is, and why it matters so much, is that even if you are really bright, when you join one of these firms, you're going to be working with experienced partners and principals and project leaders, and you're going to be working with directors and VPs and CEOs at huge client firms that have a ton of experience, and there's going to be a lot of stuff thrown at you. It might be the first time you've had to build a model or do a really good job telling a story via PowerPoint slides. Or how do you present to a CEO and nudge them gently toward one option that you know might be better, but that he is disinclined to accept for various reasons. Just all sorts of things that are going to come up on the job. And the project leaders and the principals and partners on your case are going to help coach you through doing those things really well and doing them quickly. And you're going to get a lot of feedback about that. And so that process is great. That actually makes you a more talented employee and a more valuable person in the labor market in general. So that's fantastic. You want that. And the reality is, if in the interview you demonstrate that you don't listen to any sort of feedback, or someone gives you really good direction and you just ignore it, that's going to be a really big red flag in an interviewer's mind because they're immediately going to be thinking, well, if we're on a case together, what's that person going to do? What's he or she going to do if I give them a really good tip or show them, like, here's the right way to approach this type of model building, and they just ignore me? That's going to be, a huge kind of what if in their mind because coaching is such an important part of how you succeed on the job. So that's why it really matters so much. Now let's go ahead and look at some live examples from an interview scenario and demonstrate what good coachability versus mediocre or straight up poor coachability actually looks like. Okay, so let's now look at some examples. As I mentioned, we're going to do 3 examples, and in each example we go through, we're going to have the same scenario. So I'm going to talk about the basics of the scenario first. So the scenario is going to be we're in an interview, and the candidate is supposed to size the U.S. market for commercial jet engines, the U.S. annual market for commercial jet engines. And as that prompt is put forward, the candidate says, okay, I'm going to start with the population of the U.S., which is roughly 330 million. And the interviewer pauses the candidate and says, have you considered starting with a number of U.S. commercial airlines based in the U.S.? So that's a scenario where we've got the candidate trying to size the market for the U.S. market for commercial jet engines, and he is going to start with the population of the U.S. And the interviewer makes a suggestion about starting with a number of U.S.-based airlines instead. So now we're going to do the first example, which is an example of poor coachability. So in that case, if I'm the candidate, I might say, no, I'm going to move forward with using 330 million people as a start, and then I go through and start sizing the market that way. Now, this actually happens a lot in case interviews. And the reason for it is usually not that the candidate thinks the person on the other side of the table is stupid and doesn't have good suggestions, but usually in a misplaced belief that the candidate needs to show extreme confidence in anything he or she says. And so for that reason, they just charge down the path they were going initially, even though the interviewer is really giving some good direction about, maybe there's a better way to do this. And, in this case, the candidate basically just says no and goes down the same old path. So they do listen to the feedback at least. They got the first part of coachability there, but they certainly didn't really consider it, and they definitely didn't apply it. And in this particular scenario, trying to size the market that way is going to end in a lot of pain and likely a very incorrect answer. Okay, so now let's look at a medium or kind of a mediocre demonstration of coachability. Definitely not as bad as the previous one, but not as good as the ultimate one that we'll look at. And remember here that the scenario is a market sizing drill for the U.S. annual commercial jet engine market. Okay, so after the candidate said, I'm going to start with a U.S. population of 330 million, and the interviewer says, have you considered using the number of U.S. airlines? Let's say the candidate says, oh, interesting, I hadn't thought about that, but I'm really comfortable using U.S. population, so I'm going to start with that. Okay, so in this case, the candidate gets a little further in terms of demonstrating coachability. They listen to what the interviewer suggested. They give it some consideration and verbalize it, so the interviewer knows that at least the candidate thought about that option, and then ultimately went with the original choice. So it's nice because there's at least some demonstration that there's some consideration. However, there's not a lot of dialogue there and not a lot of information that the candidate offers up about why they decide to return to the original path despite the new suggestion from the interviewer. So it's a little better certainly than the poor example that we looked at, but not as good as where you want to get to. So let's look at that next. Okay, so let's look at our final example of demonstrating good coachability. And again, remember the scenario is the jet engine market in the US, and the interviewer says, have you considered starting with a number of airlines based in the US? And let's say in this case, the candidate says, oh, that's really interesting. That could be a really good starting point because you don't need to get from people to number of airplanes, which would be tough. But kind of by chance, my father actually works in the airline industry, so I know a bunch of random statistics about the airline industry in the US, including one which is the number of commercial airplanes that exist per population in the US. So I was going to use that to get to the number of planes, and I thought that might be a really accurate way to get to the estimate. But I'd be happy to actually use US airlines as a starting point if you think that's better. Okay, so I'm going to pause there. That's a really good example of demonstrating coachability because the candidate clearly listened to the feedback coming from the interviewer. They considered it and indicated why it might be an interesting path. They said, oh yeah, US airlines might be helpful. You could get to planes easily that way. And then finally, they also indicate why they were interested in going down the path they were and what their kind of evidence or arguments for going down that path. And in this case, the candidate actually had a really good reason because he knew a very particular statistic that was going to help him get to the number of planes in the US, which is the crucial ingredient for getting this estimate accurately. So this is a very good example of demonstrating the thought process of why he was going a certain way, indicating he was willing to change if the interviewer really thought there was a better method, but also giving the evidence of why he thought his current path was good. And then to top it all off, he also says, if you really think I should start this way though, I'd be willing to. So he kind of extends an olive branch at the very end, which is a really nice job of showing that he is open and willing to consider, but unless someone really kind of forces him to go down that path, because he has good information, he's going to stick to his original intent. Now, that's a really good example. I wanted to put that one out there because being coachable doesn't always mean you take the advice. Like we talked about at the very beginning, it's listening, considering, and then applying if necessary. So in this last example, the candidate does a really good job of all three of those steps. Now, he doesn't apply it, but you can imagine plenty of other examples of demonstrating good coachability where the candidate doesn't have that crazy awesome stat that works for this situation and says, oh, that's interesting, US Airlines, that would be a really good place to start. I didn't think about that. I'm going to switch and go that way. And that would also be demonstrating great coachability as well, because in that case, the candidate is listening, considering the input, realizing that's a better path, and then applying it that way. So that would be a great example as well. But the key takeaway is it's all three of those steps, listening, considering, and applying if necessary. And it doesn't mean you always have to take the suggestion. It can go either way. You can demonstrate good coachability kind of regardless of which door you go down. One final thing on coachability. We've already talked about what exactly it is and how important it is both in the interview and the actual job. But there's something we haven't mentioned yet, which is if you think about what consulting firms actually do and what they get paid for, they're essentially coaching clients and top firms across the world on how to be better at their own business. And if you think about that and what that means, if you're an incoming consultant to one of these firms like McKinsey, Bain, or BCG, it means you're getting coaching that world-class companies are paying millions of dollars for free, and you're being paid to get that coaching. So if you're not coachable, you're going to forgo all of that incredible benefit. That would be a huge mistake. So being coachable has added benefits for yourself as well, as that you are going to become a better employee, a better consultant, a better business leader because of it. So thanks again for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet already, there's a big red button below. Please subscribe. We've got lots of great videos on the case interview process coming out weekly. So thank you again for watching and have a great day.